Now is the winter of our discontent, or rather the summer of my discontent, because I spent 4 days straight buried in Shakespeare for this video. I was originally going to include a Shakespeare hater analyzes Richard III in the title of it, but after forcing myself to read the play, watch 4 versions of the play, read a spin-off play, and then analyze all of that and really think creatively about it and not academically about it, I hate him less. Sometimes things take so long to research that I grow as a human by the end of it, and it's very weird. This happened with Ride the Cyclone as well. I don't really get it either, but you know what? We're here for the ride, and that's why YouTube is fun. But before we talk about my general beef with Mr. Shaky Boy, hi, my name is Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. Hopefully my camera's in focus this video. I'm an openly queer, disabled, autistic, trans, non-binary actor, composer, educator, media analyst, and disability advocate. I make video essays about disability-related things that I find interesting and or important, and I'm a white person in my early 20s with light brown chest length, curly hair. I am currently wearing a white puffy off-the-sleeve shirt with a navy blue galaxy star corset that is tied together with white and ivory colored lining and ribbon. I made it myself. I'll put a better picture of it on the screen if you want to see the whole thing. It's on my Instagram. I'm really proud of it. This was terrible to make, but I finished it and I did it and I learned a new skill. And I am sitting in front of a bookshelf, and above the bookshelf there are some paintings and some photos. Great. Glad to have you here. Thanks for being here. Let's dive in. We're gonna start with why Shakespeare bothers me. Not the guy himself. He was very anti-Semitic, so maybe kind of the guy itself, but I'm more bothered by the concept of him and generally the culture that surrounds Shakespeare. And it generally boils down to 2 major things. One, old-timey artists are not inherently better or more genius than modern artists, and old art is not inherently better or more worthy than new art. And 2, if you find a particular old-timey author or playwright or artist to be confusing or overwhelming or inaccessible to you, you are not any less intelligent or any less of an artist or any less worthy as a human being, because old-timey art is not the end-all and be-all of art and intellect. But let's unpack those 2 a little bit further. With point 1, we have this idea that people who created art a long time ago are better or smarter than ones today, when in reality, we just think that because we have so few extant works from back then that we feel like these people had less artistic inspiration and therefore came up with absolutely everything on their own. And yes, they probably had less inspiration than what we do today because we have the internet and more people and more art to be inspired by. But I guarantee you that Mr. Shaky Boy had so many contemporaries that he based his work off of that we have literally never heard of and probably never will. He also used actual historical events or myths about historical events, we'll talk about that later, as a basis for a lot of his works, and he took a lot of inspiration from Commedia dell'arte, and nobody talks about that enough because the point of Commedia is that it's not written down, and also it was seen as a low form of art, but now when we talk about Commedia, everybody's like, oh, so it's like these characters in Shakespeare. Commedia began as a thing 40 years before Shakespeare's first play. I might just be very biased towards Commedia. It's one of my favorite things ever, and it's wildly underappreciated. I have a video about it as an analysis of autistic humor patterns linked in the card above, but I feel like it's super underappreciated because it wasn't really written down, and I want more people to appreciate it because we need more Commedia and slapstick comedy in the world. Anyway, the other part of point 1 that kind of ties into point 2 is that we have this thing where we see old stuff as inherently more important and more intellectual. And I very much think that this ties back to the era of in the 1700s when you went to Cambridge, you had to learn Latin and Greek in order to be considered a successful and smart person, where Western society sees Mr. Shakes and older works as the epitome of knowledge and literature and education. And old works are so important. They can teach us so much. I personally love reading classics, particularly from the late 1800s and early 1900s, because to me it reminds me that the human struggles that we have today are the same ones that they had hundreds of years ago, and it makes me feel closer to my ancestors and other people on this earth. Also, a lot of these works are cultural staples in the sense that so much is inspired by them, so it makes me see the rest of the artistic world very differently as well because I suddenly understand lots of references. However, our education system has taken old works teach us stuff and are important and has turned it into, if you don't understand old works, you are not a real intellectual. And measures of intelligence are already ableist and dated and problematic. I rant about this frequently, but we also need to acknowledge that many people, particularly students whose entire identity is centered around the fact that they are supposed to be learning things, measure their worth and intelligence. And it is a systemic problem that we should be re-examining, but it is still one that happens. And in my experience, Shakespeare is the major thing in the literature side of the school system that we use as a barometer of intelligence and yet rarely teach accessibly. So large portions of the population go into the world thinking that they're never going to like Shakespeare and or they're stupid because they were failed by the education system. And I am one of those people. Sort of. Because in middle school, I never understood it. I was the kind of kid who read 2 to 3 books a week and then would open a Shakespeare play and be unable to get past page 5. It felt convoluted and overwhelming and more like homework because I was trying to like parse out every single sentence and I felt like I didn't understand it enough to be able to move forward enough to get lost in the story. And as a young theater kid, I thought that meant I would never be able to be an actor, and it is one of the reasons I initially decided to give up acting. Because like, if I couldn't understand the plays of all time, how was I going to be able to succeed in anything else? But then, in high school, I had 2 teachers who genuinely loved Shakespeare and understood it thoroughly enough to really take the time and dissect it with us and make it make sense. One of whom had us act out scenes from the Scottish play. That was how I learned that Shakespeare can be fun. And also, I'm apparently a great sword fighter, so that's a really fun, thing to learn about myself. I didn't come out of those classes loving him or wanting to voluntarily read any other Shakespeare plays, but I did come out of those classes knowing that if I really wanted to understand it, it was possible, and I had the tools and the resources to do that. And those are also the teachers who convinced me that I should do theater and led me on the path that I'm on today. And I did consult with them for this video, so thank you so much for your help. Anyway, the biggest thing about Shakespeare is that it can be made accessible. If you stage it properly, it can make complete sense. If you teach it accessibly, it can make complete sense. There are entire textbooks about how to teach Shakespeare accessibly to neurodivergent folks. I own them. They're over here. I'll put the titles in the description for you if you want to check them out. But in my experience, the way we teach and stage Shakespeare usually comes across as, these are fancy words and fancy text, and I understand it because I am smart. And if you don't understand my analysis of it or the way that I speak it, you are not smart. And I have always been of the opinion that if you cannot explain a concept to a 6-year-old, you do not understand the concept, and that kind of applies here. My high school teachers had that level of knowledge, and that's what made me almost like it. And also makes me willing to do a Shakespeare show one day, if only to honor how influential they were in my life and go, hey guys, I did the thing I thought I could never do because of you guys. But the thing with the theater world is, I'm getting to the important part of this video. I just need to talk about this real quick. For most of history, theater has been super delegitimized and seen as sinful. Acting has been seen as sinful, and so people will hold on to the fact that Shakespeare's plays are seen as highbrow art and hold on to that for dear life to make theater seem more legitimate as a career and as an art form, which I get. But that is no excuse to act like anybody who doesn't understand an inherently inaccessible group of plays is not worth being in the theater. So yes, while Shakespeare was an incredible creator and artist whose work completely changed the world we live in today, and also he contributed like 1,700 new words to the English language, that's pretty darn cool, he's not the best playwright ever. He's not the coolest playwright ever. He is a person who wrote cool stuff, just like Pushkin and Eugene O'Neill and Chekhov and Susan Laurie Parks and my mentor and some of my best friends, and let's not be elitist or gatekeepy about it, because that's gross and icky and I don't like it. Many of the Shakespeare lovers that I know are not elitist or gatekeepy about it, but the way that the education system handles Shaky Boy completely overpowers that in messaging, particularly in acting and theater education, where literally everything is explained in relation to Mr. Shake's plays, because they just assume that everybody there knows them really well, which makes students like myself feel automatically less worthy of being in the acting space solely because I don't sit down with Shakespeare plays and soak them in like a sponge. And I can also only assume that like half of the other people in those rooms who also go, oh yeah, I know what you're referring to, also have absolutely no idea, but we all pretend that we do because we don't want to seem out of place. And it's annoying. And it also contributes to the elitist idea of like, if you're an actor who doesn't love Shakespeare, you're not a good actor, which drives me up the wall. So, some neurodivergent folks are really, really drawn to Shakespeare and love him, and others scream and run in the other direction, and both of those are equally valid, and I support you regardless of which side you're on. Just please don't think that you're better than everybody else for being on one side or the other, because that's weird and pointless and not a good use of your time or energy. So either way, whether you like him or not, this channel is a safe space for you. I'm gonna get off my soapbox and let's talk about the actual meat of this video. You read the title. You know we're gonna talk about how Shakespeare messed up disability representation. Obviously that's like a little bit of an exaggeration because he didn't create out of a void, as we just talked about earlier. He was somewhat reflecting his reality, but his works shaped our culture a lot and our art a lot. So most of the disability representation issues that we have today can in fact in one way or another be traced back to his 1593 play. play King Richard III. Also, if you have any other cursed names for Shakespeare other than Shaky Boy and Mr. Shakes and Mr. Shaky Boy, please drop them in the comments, because I got tired of typing the same word a million times over and over again and needed to spice it up so I wouldn't lose my mind, but I'm always down for more ideas and more fun things. Okay, so Richard III is my guy's most performed work according to some sources I read, and then not on the list of the top 10 from some other sources. So I don't know, man. It is one of his earlier plays, and it's also his second longest, and it's categorized as either a history or a tragedy depending who you talk to. I would say both because it's a historical thing, but also everybody dies. It was the first play of his performed in the American colonies in 1750. It was also the first feature-length silent film with extant pieces of it semi-recently found that dated to 1912, which is 2 years before Birth of a Nation. For a very brief synopsis of the play, Richard of Gloucester wants the throne, and he's gonna get it. Also, there's like a prophecy that he's not gonna live long after seeing Richmond, and another one that he's gonna die a very bloody death, because prophecies are like always a thing in Shakespeare. Anyway, he tries to get the throne by murdering pretty much every relative of his, and also some other people, and then he becomes king. He also tries to marry his niece to further strengthen his legitimacy to the throne, which is a choice. And then, near the end, he gets haunted by visions of the people that he murdered, and he's like, the horrors of my actions, I will become more paranoid and evil. And then he goes to battle, and somebody kills his horse out from underneath him, and he's like, give me a horse, and that's a famous line. And then he gets killed by Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Generally, Richard is a manipulative prick, for lack of a better way to put it. He'll do anything to get what he wants. He's a great actor and will say anything to get what he wants, but no matter how much he wishes he could, one cannot manipulate prophecy. Now, if you're thinking, how is disability involved? We're gonna get there shortly. First, let's talk about the real Richard, the King of England from 1483 to 1485. His reign was followed by Henry VII, which is the first Tudor monarch. Based on my very general synopsis I just gave you, the real history is quite similar, though unless I am interpreting the text wrong, his real-life motive is not really in the play. Basically, Richard's brother King Edward IV had a will that said that if he were to die, Richard would become the protector of the kingdom until his son was old enough to take the crown, which is kind of like being a regent. And then when Edward died in 1483, the family of his wife, the Woodvilles, tried to scoot towards the throne to take power instead. Whether they actually intended to follow Edward's will or not, who knows, but Richard decided to be proactive, just in case. And so he started imprisoning and killing people. He managed to wipe out literally every single member of the direct royal line, including the two young sons of Edward, in like 6 or 7 weeks. And then he landed himself on the throne as king for a little bit. But before all of this, he was seen as like a war hero and everybody loved him. And then they transitioned to being like, we're not giving you power, go away. And then they went, oh, we're scared of you, do whatever, I guess that's fine. And then after the princes were presumed dead, there was an underground anger amongst the nobles, one of whom reached out to her son, Henry Tudor, who'd been told years before by a king that he would take the throne one day and had exiled himself to France to not get murdered. And then he came back with an entire army, and then they stabbed Richard a lot, and then the Tudors were in power for the next 118 years. Is that a gross generalization? Absolutely. Does it do the trick for what we need in this video? Absolutely. The Wars of the Roses were wild. Definitely learn more about them if you're interested. But I went down too many rabbit holes for this video, so I decided not to go down that one. Now that we know all of that, let's talk about the disability. We're going to do a little bit of textual analysis, but I promise you that it's going to be short and somewhat entertaining and also important for the thesis of this video. There are a lot of insults that are hurled at him that vaguely reference his disability by calling him ugly in various ways. I personally feel like those could be equally hurled at a conventionally attractive, able-bodied person who is, I don't know, going around murdering people and make just as much sense. So I'm not going to include those here as evidence of his disability. We're only going to go through the major times that he references his own disability. First is the famous Act 1, Scene 1 monologue, which I will read and then give a short translation. I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks nor made to court an amorous looking glass. I, that am rudely stamped and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph. I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time, into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that's so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why I in this weak piping time of peace have no delight to pass away the time, unless to see my shadow in the sun, and descant on mine own deformity. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these farewell spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain, and hate the idle pleasures of these days. This roughly translates to, I'm not like other girls, because I'm very ugly because I was born with congenital differences that are so noticeable that dogs bark at me when I go by them, and I halt by them so I walk differently, and I also cannot find anybody to love me because I'm unlovable, so I have nothing to do with my free time except sit around and think about how sad I am that I'm disabled. So I've decided to spend my time hating the world and becoming a villain. He opens the play with this. It's basically him telling the people who he is and what his motive is for the whole thing, and his motive is that he's disabled and horny and sad. In Act 1, Scene 2. In Act 1, Scene 2, he describes himself as me that halts and am misshapen thus. And then in Act 3, Scene 4, he says, "Look how I am bewitched. Behold, mine arm is like a blasted sapling withered up. And this Edward's wife, that monstrous witch, consorted with that harlot strumpet shore, that by their witchcraft thus have marked me." Which roughly translates to, hey, look at my withered arm. This is because my brother's wife is actually a witch, and she and her maid have cursed me, so you should feel bad for me and hate them because they're actually the treasonous ones. So basically he's trying to be his manipulative, controlling self, trying literally anything to get the government folks on his side because nobody really likes him. Generally, specifically because of these few passages, he is described as having a hunched back, a withered arm, which I will refer to as an arm difference for the rest of this video, and an uneven gait. Also, if I missed any other personal mentions of his disability, that's likely. But I still feel like after reading the play twice and watching it like 5 times, I probably missed things, but I tried my best. I've decided to let this passage that I stumbled upon on the SparkNotes quotes page for Richard III begin our discussion of why this representation has problems, because truly, this literary analysis is the epitome of why I made this video in the first place. In the opening monologue of the play, Richard describes his physical deformity and unattractiveness. He feels handicapped by his hunchback and visage, and lets his deformed, misshapen body come to be the living embodiment of his own twisted nature. The fact that Richard can analyze the relationship between his body and his personality demonstrates a presence of mind that indicates that he could also choose to overcome his physical limitations. Instead, however, he succumbs to his base nature. While his body has helped give birth to the evil inside him, Richard himself helps that evil grow and thrive. Okay, let's unpack this. We're gonna pack it line by line, starting with he lets his deformed, misshapen body come to be the living embodiment of his own twisted nature. Now, the biggest issue here is that the idea of disability as metaphor, equating outside physicality with internal experience, is a problem. And this play basically says that his outside disability reflects his inner psychological brokenness and immorality, which isn't a good look. But back to the quotation here. The fact that Richard can analyze the relationship between his body and his personality demonstrates a presence of mind that indicates that he could also choose to overcome his physical limitations. This makes it seem like he has chosen to be disabled and is super calculated and controlling about how he chooses to wield his disability, for lack of a better way to put it, in a way to hold power over others. It's not just that he's fundamentally bad because he's disabled, but also that he is conscious of that and chooses not to change that fact or do anything to make his life and situation better. And then part 3 of this quote, instead, however, he succumbs to his base nature. While his body has helped give birth to the evil inside him, Richard himself helps that evil grow and thrive, which further entrenches that this disability is his motivation for evil. We call this the mutilated avenger trope, and that he has no control over this. His disability has stamped him for life as unnatural and is inherent to his nature, and he is doomed to fulfill the prophecy of being evil and cannot do anything about it because he is disabled. This idea is one of the main reasons there was and is such a prevalent assumption that disabled folks inherently have personality disorders. This is where that comes from. But overall, I feel like this idea comes from a place of, we use this trait to explain human motivation to do ruthless and cruel things, so as to say, well, I can't cause harm because I'm not like that, which makes us feel better and also helps us cope with the fact that there are real people who do horrible things for no visible reason. We make very similar excuses for race and for queerness and for fatness and for all kinds of minority people. This is not new and it's been around for forever. Also, for the record, I'm not critiquing this SparkNotes analysis of the text because this is generally the analysis that we see from the majority of scholars about this play throughout history. They were spot on with this. So the question now is, where did his disability come from? Was he really disabled, or was Shakespeare just so strapped for a motive that he threw this in randomly? And the answer is yes, but no, but then kind of maybe yes, but then actually no, definitely yes, but then like kind of, and then maybe. To further expand on that, in Shakespeare's time, the Tudors, the people who killed Richard, were in power, and so they told everybody that he was disabled. It can indeed be shown that Shakespeare culled his disabled Richard from an account by Sir Thomas More, a version of which is traceable to Bishop Ely, who historians suggest invented the deformity of the kind as a stratagem for proving the wholesale malignity of the previous regime. Basically saying that he was unfit to rule because he was physically unfit. And this view of disability was pretty much normal around the time that initially was published, and around the time of Shakespeare writing this play, and a disabled Richard III has now been further entrenched into society because of Shakespeare. And over time, the line between like the real Richard and the play Richard became really wishy-washy, so most things that you read now will talk about them as if they're the same person. Some historical records from the time describe him as having slightly uneven shoulders, but nobody could agree which shoulder was higher up, which means that it couldn't have been that visible of a difference, and generally no other disabilities were ever written about in descriptions of his appearance. He was talked about as being like a conventionally attractive guy. Also, I should mention the whole thing from the play that he couldn't find love or have shenanigans with the person he loves is untrue, because he had a son named Edward who died at the age of 10, but he did do adult things. Now, during the Industrial Revolution era, people fully believed that this disability was a myth and often remarked that seeing people perform disability on stage in this play was buffoonery and that Shakespeare was simply creating a caricature of a real person because it was one of his earlier plays and he didn't quite know what he was doing. Then we get to the 1900s when science became more of a thing and people were like, oh, it's simply a lack of insight into medicine. We're gonna figure out his precise diagnosis with our new scientific knowledge, and that will teach us so much more about his character and his psychology as a deeply unnatural person. This is also when medicine saw, well, I guess we still somewhat see, physical impairment as including repression, self-pity, aggression, sexual dysfunction, and an essential inability for self-reflection. So basically, Richard, as a disabled person, had to, by default, be angry, lonely, hate himself, be not self-aware, and also be really horny, and therefore become a murderous villain because of that. Because medicine. So this era began the trend of actors using his disability as a way to find the psyche of this character and give him more depth. And this is also during the rise of major acting training as a thing. We've discussed that history elsewhere in this channel. I won't bore you with the details, but there's a lot of interesting overlap between how you can see how the adaptations of Richard III have changed in relation to what type of acting training was popular at the time. Very interesting. Now in 2012, some archaeologists found the guy's skeleton, and that gave us a much more definitive answer about what was going on here. I watched a wonderful 70-minute archaeological talk given by Matthew Morris, who's one of the folks who found him. Even if you're not that into archaeology, he explained everything really clearly, including all of the processes of like how they confirmed that it was in fact Richard. It was super fascinating. I highly, highly recommend. I've linked it in the description for you because you should go watch it. But they basically found that Richard did in fact have scoliosis, but it was the kind of scoliosis that created a sideways curve in his lower spine, not a forward hunch. And it was also not congenital, which means visible from birth, and it would have appeared during puberty like most scoliosis does, so this would have made his shoulders slightly uneven and made him a bit shorter than he typically would have grown, and there was also nothing else on his skeleton that showed any sign of an uneven walking pattern or any arm difference. Based on his skeleton, they estimate that upon looking at him in real life, you might have seen his proportions felt a little bit off. If he like leaned forward to pick something up, one of his shoulder blades would have probably stuck out more prominently, but generally given the fashions of the time and the longer haircuts of the time, most of this would not be visible or noticeable if you were wearing clothes, which most people did most of the time back then. And also now. And that further shows that this was likely an over-exaggerated Tudor propagandic myth to more legitimize their rule than reality. So that's Richard III, and frankly, this literary analysis is very similar to the 90-second ones I make twice a week on TikTok. We see these tropes literally all the time. Structurally, it's not that special or that problematic as a representation, but the reason that it warrants this full video is because unlike a problematic film that came out in 2017 that not many people really watched and is already kind of forgotten about, most of our culture and language and art is somehow based on Shakespeare. Like, even more than we think, it is everywhere. He was not the first to come up with the idea of star-crossed lovers, or the mutilated Avenger villains, or enemies to lovers, or the anti-Semitic mess that was Merchant of Venice, but because his work was so revolutionary in culture back then, and is carried to today, where statistically there is always at minimum one Shakespeare play being performed or rehearsed at any given time, and over 1,000 IMDb writer mentions of the guy. And that also doesn't even count, like, all of the things that are based on his work in one way or another that are also incredibly popular, and then the things that aren't based on Shakespeare, but are inspired by something else that is based on Shakespeare, because all art is in some way connected. And so, at this point, While the message of Richard III is objectively a problem, I can't really be mad at Shaky Boy about it because he's the perfect example of how after it's released, art no longer belongs to the artist. Like, if he knew that a gazillion people would have seen his play, would he have written it differently? I don't know. But anyway, what I mean to say is that this message did not originate with him. On some level, he was reflecting the ideas of his time, but it blew up because he was Shakespeare. And then everybody over time has been like, oh, this is legitimate because Shakespeare's high-level art, and then made their own art inspired by the great work of late Mr. Shaky Boy. And now here we are with a super harmful media trope, and one that we cannot seem to shake. I just made a pun. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. That was wonderful. Let's pretend that was purposeful. Anyway, so this trope is bad. It was a problem then, but then when silent film became a thing, it got way worse. All visual and performing arts on some level have an aspect of the physicality aids in telling the story, which is why I'm particularly interested in dissecting disability and its impacts on art and theater, and also how art impacts how humans see the world and our fellow human beings. It's fascinating, but with silent film, they relied even further on physicality because they really only had that visual, physical movement and the music being played along with the film to create these characters. So making your villains be big, scary, imposing hunchbacks, or somebody who walks differently or has a limb difference, something that is visually very different, which makes it therefore unsettling and creepy. We call this narrative expediency, when a visual cue tells you a lot about a character and therefore they don't need to spend precious screen time trying to explain or demonstrate to you that this person is a bad guy. And we still do this on some level, not just with bad guys either, with all kinds of people, not just with physicality, but also like color and pattern choices in costumes and settings. If you want a really great example of coloring and costuming and how that shows character traits and relationships, Me Before You is a problematic film, but the costuming team did a wonderful job with that, and it's really interesting to look at. Anyway, sorry, I digress. Yeah, color and pattern choices in costumes and settings, music and sound design, lighting design, makeup design, with how characters speak and accents, all kinds of things. And it's not inherently a problem. The problem is when your cue to the audience of this person is a bad person or this person is this kind of person also denotes their minority status and uses that as a tool. And it's not just disability, like Scar from The Lion King is both a mutilated Avenger and also super incredibly queer coded. And we've talked about the history of coding and narrative expediency and where all that came from a few months ago. I'll link the video in the card above for you. But the thing with narrative expediency is that it requires the audience to make connections between external appearance of characters and then their inner motivations. And that's not a hard leap. We know that people judge and act based on appearance literally all the time, and that was a thing long before film existed. But the problem is that film almost confirms our suspicions for us. It requires us to see outside appearance as a shortcut for somebody's internal psychology with clear correlation between the two, and then the script will confirm that said judgment was correct. And then we get so used to seeing the disabled person become the villain at the end of the day without realizing it that when we see disabled folks in real life, we automatically distrust them. And we start to look at disabled people as if they're a metaphor and we expect to find meaning from their differences. Because in the media we consume, those differences usually hold inherent meaning, and so we get kind of conditioned to expect that. Which is a serious issue for disabled people who go through performance training, but we're going to talk about that in a second. First, let's talk about the literal impact on media. As far as we know, Richard III was the first feature-length silent film. Some discussions about the film have said that it was made to try to legitimize film as a valid art form because many people viewed it to be scandalous at the time, and therefore by doing a noble Shakespeare work, it should be viewed as a quality art form by the elite. I find that fascinating because historically, acting and plays had the same issue, and then people use Shakespeare plays to legitimize performance as an art form and still do that to this day. And all of this ties back to the unfortunate elitism that has taken over Shaky's work, but we've already talked about that. The film was not the major success that they expected it to be at the time, but there are so many famous films from later in the silent film era that followed the exact same trope, and it definitely took some level of inspiration from Richard, such as Nosferatu and Phantom of the Opera. Those are both inspired by famous books that, based on preliminary research, do not seem directly inspired by Richard III, but the way that the disabilities are portrayed on screen was definitely inspired by it. There's also so many film adaptations throughout history of The Hunchback of Notre Dame during the silent and golden eras. There's like 6 or 7, I think. Hunchback is a slightly different tone from Richard, but Victor Hugo was actually super inspired by Shakespeare and wrote about it a lot in all of his writing, so there's a serious correlation there. Not to sidetrack us, but that's my channel, I guess. Disney just announced a live-action remake of Hunchback. I'm displeased about it, but I'm planning on making a historical literature and film breakdown like this one for Hunchback and how that changed our culture as well, so stay tuned for that. It's gonna take me some time because I need a break after this one. Hugo also wrote the play that inspired the opera Rigoletto, which is about a hunchback who's teased for his appearance and internalizes it and then becomes kind of evil. So I'm not sure what my man Hugo was up to, but whatever. The famous Captain Ahab from Moby Dick, whose sole existence is, I lost my leg because of a whale, so now I'm gonna find and kill the whale. Also, I'm kind of a really mean human being, is based on several different Shakespeare characters combined, but most notably Richard III. Ahab has also had a serious downline of problematic inspiration that came from it. Most of my textbooks of disability media have one chapter about Richard III that is directly followed by a chapter about Ahab from Moby Dick. It's really weird. I'm not reading Moby Dick for a video. I refuse to do that, so we're not getting a deep dive into that one. Some articles that I read also talk about how the Shakespearean trope likely inspired Dr. Strangelove, Darth Vader, a lot of Bond villains, maybe even Captain Hook. It's really hard to know who was inspired by what, in the same way that you could say all stories of star-crossed lovers are inspired at the root somehow by Romeo and Juliet, but nobody keeps like an explicit record of what they were inspired by, particularly when a trope is so prevalent in general culture. But we can make the argument, right? And again, he was not the first person to come up with this idea. There are several commedia characters that show their crookedness or their stupidness via some sort of physical difference, particularly with a hunched back or uneven shoulders. This idea was not new at the time that Richard was published. The thing about this play is that it took a common trope in physical theater, which was seen as a low form of art, and put it into what we now see as high art, which then legitimized it. Not only would Richard III influence future artistic grappling with disability, disabled artists would be forced to navigate the social and moral quagmire of public perceptions now given a high art sanction. It's a bit of a confusing quote, but what it's generally saying is that Richard III influences future artists trying to figure out how to present disability in their art, but it also influences disabled artists who are trying to simply exist within an art form that sees this famous portrayal of disability as the fundamentally right one that they have internalized and based their entire education system off of. People in the arts spent their training learning how to dissect characters like Richard III and how to connect psychology and physicality, and so they see it as the right thing to do in order to master their craft, and then when they see somebody with different physicality, they automatically assume their psychology whether they realize it or not, and then often will refuse to teach them or work with them fairly or treat them fairly, particularly those in physical theater. I talk about this a lot on my channel, like if you're new here, a lot of my channel is about accessible education and how to change your education system to be accessible, so I'm not going to reiterate that stuff here, but this level of artistic analysis and training has thoroughly messed up generations of art education and educators, and we're only now starting to unpack that in the last like 5 to 10 years, and it's a lot of it comes from Richard III. But with all of this knowledge, the question is, how can we ethically stage this play, and can we ethically stage this play? Scott Coley's influential performance history, Richard's Himself Again, A Stage History of Richard III, divides 400 years of production into two opposed camps. Those who exaggerate his deformities in order to supply the play with an otherwise absent motivation, and those who downplay Richard's disabilities as an archaic characterization device and focus instead on the rhetoric of intrigue. Now we're going to go through some particular adaptations of note and talk through where they fit into those two camps, what I noticed and learned about them, and then we are going to discuss what I propose, where I just suddenly randomly decide to direct this play for some reason. I watched the 1955 Laurence Olivier film, the 1995 Ian McKellen film, the 2016 Benedict Cumberbatch film, 2022 Shakespeare in the Park with Denai Guerrero, which is incredible. We're gonna get to that. And I read the 2018 play Teenage Dick. I began this journey really not caring about Shaky Boy, and then by the third adaptation, I was genuinely excited by it, and I like understood most of the text to the point where like, maybe I'm starting to like him? Maybe. Also, we're analyzing these in timeline order, not in the order that I watched them, because I watched them completely out of order. So first was the 1955 Laurence Olivier film, where he both directed and played the titular character. I'm not gonna lie, I was quite disappointed by this one. Theater school really hammers home that Laurence Olivier is the best actor of all time, so I kind of just assumed that, and was therefore very excited to watch him perform, and like, oh, I'm gonna learn new things from him. And what I got was an understanding of how what we see as quality performance and high-level art has very much changed over time as audiences and creators and performers and culture has changed over time, and how the craft has changed and evolved. But then the curriculum for learning said craft has not at all, which is not the lesson I was going for, but definitely an interesting one. This version was very much what you expect a true-to-the-text production of Richard to be. A lot of white dudes in old-timey costumes standing and speaking the lines without a lot of movement or other indicators as to the particular meaning of the text. It is a performance style that expects the text to speak for itself and the performance to simply be the semi-bland messenger of that text, which assumes that the audience is going to entirely understand that text at face value. That's personally not my preferred kind of performance. It's not the most accessible, particularly for Shakespeare, because it doesn't make the text feel particularly alive or riveting to follow or like engaging to watch. Olivier chose to perform Richard as a kind of petulant child. It was giving serious like Lord Farquaad meets Mad Hatter with a little bit of Johnny Depp's Willy Wonka energy, sort of. The whole film felt very campy in tone and staging, which contrasted really oddly to the delivery of the text. Also, there's a line in the play where one of the little princes is like, "Uncle Richard, you should let me sit on your shoulder." And Olivier's response was to absolutely explode and start screaming at the child, which felt a little bit like a 0 to 100 for me. But if that's what he was going for, like, I guess he nailed it. For the disability itself, he walked unevenly, he held a cane in one arm, and then he didn't really use or show the other arm, and his jacket had really huge black sleeves that were tied to the bottom that dangled weirdly behind him, and I think they were supposed to make him creepier and more foreboding, but instead it felt like it was too weird, like a toddler wearing an oversized jacket that he stole from his mom. And it was almost funny and took away from his creepiness. His hair and silhouette and puffy sleeves seem to at least be vaguely historically accurate based on a general Google, but I cannot find any inspiration for the dangly sleeves, so I'm not sure what was up with that. Overall, he definitely leaned into the "my disability is the root cause of why I act like a child and I'm a terrible person" thing. He really leaned into that one. The next version was the 1995 Ian McKellen film directed by Richard Loncraine. This film was set in the 1930s with Ian's Richard modeled after Sir Oswald Mosley, who was the leader of the British Union of Fascists and had a similar disability to Shakespeare's Richard. The film used a lot of fascist aesthetics to add to the tyranny message of the piece, and it basically like created a fake British Civil War to set it in. This version felt a little bit more natural in the sense of how they deliver the text with mannerisms and tone and whatnot. And it was definitely easier to follow than the Olivier production, but because they were all based on interwar period soldiers, many of the men spoke in the way that we assume military men always speak, which is very bland and straightforward without any tone, which made some of it kind of difficult to follow. I did really like how they played with the different levels between the dark and the dreary murder moments, and then like the lighthearted parties and aristocratic conversations. This play tends to get bogged down really easily, and this version broke up the monotony a little bit, but I think they could have done a little bit more of the light stuff to help accentuate the darkness and make it feel more balanced. Before we get into the specific disability aspects of this edition, I was really struck by the serious missed opportunity of making Richard III Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany in the First World War, because he was well documented as having an arm difference similar to the one described in the play, and a lot of people wrote about how he often hid it and seemed very ashamed of that difference, which is making me realize how much of my education about the causes of the First World War relied on Richard III ideals of like, he was a sad disabled guy who like started a war to feel better about himself, which is an issue. But if people are willing to base their Richard on a real disabled guy during the World War periods, I think it would have been super interesting to try to frame it as being the First World War with Kaiser Wilhelm. I want to see how they would do that. But in this film, they kept the hunchback and the arm difference, which they basically showed through costuming, and I believe McKellen walked with a sort of hobble. They also added a blind eye for some reason that I completely missed until I read about it later, so I don't know about that. And then the line from the little prince about wanting to be on his shoulder was treated more like a slightly frustrating microaggression rather than like an absolute 0 to 100 scream fest like Olivier's was, which I much preferred. Ian actually spoke about his portrayal, so we're gonna take a look at that. Before 1990, I had no interest in playing Richard III. Indeed, I had long dismissed the play as not fit for modern consumption. Its sell-by date had surely expired. Once modern psychology had questioned the cruel assumption of Shakespeare's contemporaries that physical deformity was an outward expression of some inner moral turpitude, studying the play reveals an opposite proposition, that Richard's wickedness is an outcome of other people's disaffection with his physique. His mother's cursing outburst in scene 97 exemplifies the verbal and emotional abuse which from infancy has formed her youngest son's character and behavior. Academics can be too adamant when exploring the origins of Elizabethan drama. They note the symbolism of characters in those medieval morality plays with which Shakespeare was undoubtedly familiar. They miss what actors discover, that Shakespeare fleshed out those types and made them human. And you can definitely tell that he was thinking about this in his portrayal, rather than like Olivier's, where it was just like, I'm disabled and underdeveloped and that's why I'm a murderer. This one felt a lot more like a very troubled man who became self-loathing and paranoid because of his environment and because of how the world treated him, which made the microaggression response a much better artistic and dramatic choice. This portrayal does not necessarily fix the issues with the core message of the play, but it does give a little bit more nuance, which I'm into. Next was the 2016 Hollow Crown version, played by Benedict Cumberbatch and directed by Dominic Cooke. First of all, The Hollow Crown is a BBC miniseries that adapts the consecutive history plays with the same actors throughout as overlapping characters so that you can actually follow them, because these plays have way too many characters, which makes them really difficult to follow in the best of times. And I think it's such a cool and genius idea. But again, with the theme of these adaptations seem to be improving over time, I definitely like this one better than the other two in regards to the style of acting and how they handled the text, because it was easier to follow. But the adaptation itself felt really, really bogged down. Like, they started out dark and creepy and just kept it flat and dark and creepy for the entire time, with some elements of like extra dark and creepy, and it didn't make you particularly excited or nervous for what was going to happen, because you quickly became very numb to the bland energy of it all. And it was also visually super dark most of the time. And when it wasn't visually dark, they color graded it to be super matte and like gray-ish. It was a fascinating artistic choice, and it was really interesting, but it was not my vibe, and it definitely made this production drag. But most of them kind of drag. This is such a long play. Anyway, their choices for handling the disability are definitely on par with Olivier for least favorite, maybe worse than Olivier, because they did the thing of, OMG, we know how to make prosthetics. Let's do cool prosthetics and makeup to make his disability real, which is like, artistically, they worked really hard and they did a lovely job. Good job, makeup team. But if we're going to be putting a ton of money and time and energy into making somebody look disabled, why don't we, I don't know, hire disabled folks? Just a concept. Also, they made a spine prosthetic to be shown in one scene where he was not wearing a shirt and otherwise had it completely covered, so they could have just added padding to his costumes. But then for the line about the withered arm, he did the same claw hand, like holding his arm out like this, basically, that McKellen and Olivier did, with a little bit of makeup on his arm to make it look different from your average arm. And like, I don't know, I guess it makes more sense. I guess it makes more sense to spend a lot of time with the spine prosthetic and ignore the arm prosthetic, but at the same time, both of them were technically only directly visible for a portion of one scene, so I'm not sure what the goal was with that, especially because he objectively did not need to be shirtless for the opening monologue. That was a directorial choice specifically to show off his prosthetic spine to extra prove that he was physically disabled. I'm also quite struck by the fact that at the time this adaptation was made in 2016, Richard's body had been found and known about for several years, and all of the textbooks that I read about the issue with Richard III and with disability for this video had already been published. So they had access to all of the resources telling them what was historically accurate, what was objectively a problem, and then they went 150% in the wrong direction anyway. With the 1955 and 1995 versions, I can give them the benefit of the doubt in that they didn't really have a way of knowing, because the major scholarly conversations with the full data and research had not yet been published. But this one kind of really failed me on that front. It felt like somebody took The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Nosferatu and they combined them into the ultimate visual of a villain and then acted like that was completely normal and regular and not some weird old outdated silent movie trope that you dropped into the middle of an otherwise fully fleshed out normal medieval world. Like, both in theme and in literal optics, it didn't work. Cumberbatch handled the shoulder line like it was an annoying microaggression, much like McKellen did, which I really liked. It's clear that there was inspiration from McKellen for this performance, but then he took that and he kind of made it his own. It felt tonally like a bit of a mix between my disability makes me inherently evil and I am a troubled man whose disability contributed to that troubling and made me evil. Not a lot more to say on this one. Sorry, my camera died. Lastly, we have the 2022 Shakespeare in the Park production with Richard played by Danai Gurira, who you may know from Black Panther. Oh my gosh, she was so good. And directed by Robert O'Hara. If you are not familiar with Shakespeare in the Park, every summer the Public Theater stages top-tier free Shakespeare productions in an open-air theater in Central Park, and it's really, really cool. There's also a pro shot of this production of Richard III online for free via PBS. I've linked it in the description for you because you should go watch it. This show is definitely my favorite of the four, by far. They mixed modern cadence and tone and facial expression with the old text, which made it infinitely easier to understand, and they leaned into the comedy and the absurdity of a lot of the scenes, which gave the work a lot more momentum and forward motion, rather than the slow, dreary trudging along that makes up large portions of the film adaptations that I watched. Also, Danai was absolutely incredible and had me truly captivated throughout, in a way that, like, I have not been for the other versions. And I think a part of that may have had to do with the freedom that this play gets when it's on stage rather than on a filmed set, but also her acting was amazing, and a gender-bending Richard is genius, and the fact that he was The fact that Richard was just straight up hot while being a despicable human being was fascinating to me. It makes you see him in a completely different light. Basically, you just see him as a sucky person, which is nowhere near the other portrayal style, and I'm really, really into it. They also got rid of his disability. Sort of. They didn't change any of his famous text about being marked from birth and whatnot. His speech about having a withered arm was also the same, holding out a hand held like a claw, which is how McKellen and everybody else did. But he didn't hunch or walk differently. And a solid third, if not half of the cast was visibly disabled, including actors using ASL rather than spoken text. Some of which they had other actors voice for the non-signers, and some of which they just left silent, which was very interesting to me. The thing is that at some points it felt like they'd done ability and color conscious casting, and other times it felt like they'd done ability and color blind casting, and it was kind of confusing, like whether it was deliberate or not, which made you wonder if his references to being marked for life were in reference to his race or gender, or if we were just supposed to imagine a disability, or if he was just being manipulative and gaslighty about it and he was not disabled at all, because sometimes it felt like both. The way that they presented the text was absolutely masterful, but in mixing in diversity, it often felt like they tried too many things at once and weren't quite prepared for any of them, which at what point does it mean you're just trying to make something look diverse to say you did the diversity thing without entirely putting in the effort to actually integrate diversity, you know? And you can especially tell this with how some of the hearing actors used sign language. I feel like I'm being a little bit more harsh in this production than the others, but it's mostly because it was the closest to amazing of the four, and I had really high hopes for it, and then it only halfway hit the mark, when like the other three, I didn't have much hope for, so they were about an expectation. If you're gonna watch any adaptation, definitely watch this one. I've seen it twice now. It's definitely my favorite by far, but it still has some issues. So anyway, those are the versions of the play that I watched, but I also wanted to take the time to talk about a 2018 play called Teenage Dick by Mike Liu that I read. I also found a clip of the first 10 minutes of the production of it online and a review of the original that describes the show and the plot pretty well. I've linked them both in the description for you if you want to check those out. But this play is a modern retelling of Richard III that takes place in a high school, where Richard is the weird kid who talks like he's in a Shakespeare play, also happens to have cerebral palsy, and is running for class president. And my goodness, did this play make me completely rethink all of everything with the original, because okay. The thing is that all the things in this play that are allegories for his unfounded paranoia in the original are actually kind of valid concerns for him to have as a disabled person. He isn't pulling random accusations out of nowhere. He's a disabled person looking at the objective reality of ableism and things, and everybody else is telling him he's wrong because people weren't explicitly ableist, so therefore it's fine. Which, like, sometimes he says mean things, sometimes he can be a bit calculated, sometimes he uses his disability to get away with stuff or lightly manipulate people, but you kind of feel for them because he seems genuinely nice until all of a sudden he's genuinely not nice, and it's very sudden and very close to the end of the play, and you're left really baffled. And I think that part of this is, like, in the play, he's objectively a child, unlike the original where he's an adult acting like a child. Like, with the context of Richard actually being 17 years old, his mistakes are definitely issues he should take responsibility for, but they're also more, like, logical. Like, for most of the play, you see him as a kid who messed up a few times rather than a calculated human who should be taken down at all costs. By the end, you definitely get to that point, but you're a lot more conflicted about him for a lot longer on the way there. And I think part of this would work better seeing it live, because some of the niceness later in the play is definitely more of an act, in the sense of, like, Richard manipulates people to get what he wants kind of way, which I didn't quite read on the page, but it was definitely very interesting, because, like, even his manipulation seemed like he was doing it because he didn't believe people would actually really want to see him as a friend or, like, actually want to spend time with him. So he saw all relationships as transactional because he assumed that everybody saw him that way. Or maybe I misread the tone altogether, and that was what he made other people think in order to get what he wanted out of them. This is one of those plays where an actor and a director can take the text and this character in literally any direction if they want to, so I'm completely theorizing here. But based on my reading of it, the best way that I can explain this play and this adaptation to you is that Richard III comes across as a slightly more confident Evan Hansen from Dear Evan Hansen. You want to root for him, he messes up big time, you still kind of feel for them, and then at the end you're like, he was horrible. Why? He should have faced real consequences for his actions, and why was I rooting for him? What is wrong with me? And then it makes you look at the original Richard III and start to wonder if you were looking at that Richard wrong, and maybe he's just a product of his environment, but also no, because we shouldn't be encouraging or supporting people behaving terribly regardless of ability. And, like, Richard's character and actions in this play also reminded me a bit of Nessa Rose from Wicked. We don't have time to unpack the Nessa Rose situation in this video, so we're moving on, but that's also a bucket list video at some point. This play generally handled disability and its disabled characters spectacularly, and definitely very much shows you the whole, like, Did you know that actually disabled people can do things with disabled characters that non-disabled people cannot do and have it be okay? Thing that is very much a thing. And it definitely made me look at the other Richards super differently, and also like bonus points for a really good place centering disabled characters. We don't have enough of those, but I don't think that it necessarily solved the problem of the original. As its own separate work, it is an interesting concept. I do think that we should explore disabled villainy more, but because it is disabled folks doing Richard III's story and adding extra disability context into it, it almost feels like it encourages the idea of the original play in the public's eye, if that makes any sense. That's not necessarily a bad or a good thing. I think there's an element of this is a modern retelling of a Shakespeare play that people will go to see and will learn a lot about ableism and disability acceptance from it. Disabled folks are going to see themselves on stage, probably for the first time, but the core systemic issue created by the original play is still super present here, which might be deliberate and cool. Let's reclaim that narrative. Hell yeah. But I'm not quite sure how to feel about that at the same time, and I'm not sure if that's what they were aiming for. I will also say that most of the insults in the script relate to insulting intelligence and calling people half-brained and stupid and whatnot. I know that's the general way that people insult each other, but as a disability advocate who's really used to members of the disability community, particularly those with physical disabilities, using facets of mental disabilities as jokes or insults without realizing that it further marginalizes others within the community and is inherently ableist language, definitely stuck out to me as a bit dissonant, specifically because the rest of the play was so careful and deliberate with its disability language. So this, again, could have been an artistic choice that was made to make certain characters seem more villainy, but it didn't feel intentional upon my first read. My overall thoughts on this adaptation are that I am all for super complicated, nuanced, gray area characters. One of my favorite things to do as an actor is to take an absolute a-hole of a character and make them sympathetic to the audience. I love doing it, but my favorite renditions of Richard III have been the ones where you kind of just really hate the guy the whole time through and through, and I think it serves the disability aspect of the work better if you do that, and it's also just kind of like fun to have a full like comic book level villain situation going on, and this made me more confused and baffled by the character, which is important, particularly in analyzing disabled folks, particularly for people who are unfamiliar with disability. But personally, this play made me question existence and reality, and I didn't need that. I have consumed way too much Richard III in a very short period of time to be even remotely okay. But here are my thoughts on staging it. So a common way to flip the script or update this play is to have an actually disabled person in the role of Richard. I personally think that would only further the problematic message of it all, because yes, as we saw with Teenage Dick, having disabled people play actually disabled roles gives them more nuance than non-disabled folks playing those roles, and often things unacceptable when performed by an able-bodied person are perfectly fine when performed by a disabled person. And while I think that making it actually disabled is the absolute bare minimum of ways to make it less bad, I really don't think that it's going to fix the larger issue of the thing, and we need to be talking about the larger issue. Because either way, the majority of people going into it are going to be thinking about disability, are going to be looking to find meaning in that disability, or lack thereof, simply given the text and the social understanding of the piece. So I'm thinking, why not make the disability a deliberate lack of one, and just like Twilight Zone it, as my friend called this edition. Every single actor in the production is visibly disabled, and I mean that like a lot of invisible disabilities can be made visual, including visual markers like stim toys, or sign language as a primary language, or an AAC device, or a cane, or a visible back brace, or a service dog, all kinds of things, with the exception of Richard. This then plays into how controlling and manipulative Richard is. He can play with that text further to be like, I'm ugly and oppressed, and everybody else on stage can be like, my dude, look at yourself. No, in the tone of privileged people in the majority see equality as oppression, and then just emphasizing that he is a lying, manipulative prick. Particularly with the line about the withered arm, like, just he could just hold out his arm and be like, look at my withered arm, and people can be like, what? Hello? So you start out thinking from the initial monologue that you need to suspend your disbelief about his disabilities, but then you start to realize that no, he's just a super unreliable narrator who will do anything to get what he thinks he deserves. This idea might not work, but the Shakespeare in the Park production took it halfway there, and some of it really did work, and some of it felt a little haphazard and unplanned. So I wonder what would happen if we really leaned into it. Like, I'm genuinely curious. I really want to make a production of A Christmas Carol where everybody is disabled except Scrooge and Tiny Tim, because the Tiny Tim situation is also a whole disability situation on its own that people outside of the disabled community don't talk about nearly enough. So if anybody wants to create a weird disability flipped production of King Richard III or A Christmas Carol and he's an assistant director, call me up. I have ideas for you. They may not be the best, but I want to see what would happen and how the world would view it, just for funsies, because that's what art is, right? It's just for funsies. Anyway, to sum all of this up, whether the media you're consuming is 4 years old or 430 years old, be critical of it. See how it has affected how you see the world and how the world sees minority people. Just because it's a big name on a big stage does not mean that it does not have problems. We saw that with the Best Musical winner this year. Disabled folks are not your metaphor. Our disabilities don't hide some sort of secret underlying meaning other than that we're cool. And if people, particularly theater professionals and English literature teachers, could take note of that fact and work to change that in how they teach and work in their classrooms, that would also be super rad. Now, let me know what you think about all of this in the comments. Let me know if I missed your favorite adaptation of the play, or if you have any other ideas on how to ethically stage this thing, if that's even possible. And I'm taking a week off next week after this one, but I'll be back eventually. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.